The dawn broke over the small French village, casting a warm, golden hue upon the crumbling stone walls and the remnants of a once vibrant community. The air, fresh with the scent of dew, hung heavy with an unspoken tension. Karl Wilhelm, a young German soldier, stood outside the dilapidated building that served as their makeshift barracks. He squinted against the bright sunlight, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. It was a deceptive calm, one that belied the chaos looming just beyond the horizon. "Do you think we'll ever see home again?" Karl asked, turning to his friend Hans, who was crouched nearby, fiddling with a tattered pack of cigarettes. The question hung between them, a fragile thread connecting their hopes and fears. Hans chuckled softly, a sound that almost seemed too loud in the stillness. "Of course we will. We'll march back into Berlin, medals shining on our chests, the girls waiting for us." His eyes sparkled with a mix of bravado and longing, but Karl could sense the underlying fear that accompanied such bravado. They both knew the truth. The war had changed everything. "Do you really believe that?" Karl pressed, a frown creeping onto his brow. "Every day, it feels more like a dream, one that's slipping away from us. Look around." He gestured to the village, where the remnants of life lay scattered like discarded toys, abandoned carts, rusted tools, and the ever-present specter of war looming over them. "What's left of this place?" Hans sighed, glancing around as if to take in the full weight of their situation. I know, but we must hold on to hope, Karl. It's all we have left." He lit a cigarette, the flame flickering as if it too was uncertain in the face of the impending storm. "Besides, we're soldiers. We have a duty to fight for our country, no matter the cost." Karl nodded, but the knot in his stomach tightened. He had joined the army with a sense of purpose, fueled by the fervor of nationalism and the belief that they were fighting for a greater cause. But now, as he looked at the faces of his comrades, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were mere pawns in a game far beyond their understanding. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the distant rumble of artillery began to resonate through the hills, a low growl that sent shivers down Karl's spine. The tranquility of the morning shattered, replaced by a palpable tension that engulfed the village. He exchanged a glance with Hans, and they both knew what it meant. "Orders are coming, aren't they?" Karl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like it," Hans replied, his tone now laced with concern. "We'd better get back inside. They'll want us ready for whatever's coming." The two men made their way back to the barracks, where other soldiers were gathered, their expressions mirroring the growing unease. The air was thick with the acrid scent of sweat and fear, a stark contrast to the fresh morning air they had just left behind. If you're as captivated by these stories as we are, make sure to subscribe and join us for more incredible journeys through history. You won't want to miss what's coming next. As they settled into their makeshift seats, an officer stepped forward, his uniform pressed and sharp, the insignia glinting in the dim light. "Listen up," he barked, drawing the attention of the men. "We've received reports of American forces advancing. Prepare yourselves for a potential assault. I want everyone ready for action within the hour." The words hung heavily in the air, the weight of them sinking into the soldiers' hearts. Karl felt his pulse quicken, a mix of adrenaline and dread coursing through him. He exchanged a glance with Hans, whose face had paled slightly, the bravado from earlier evaporating like mist in the morning sun. "Do you think they'll really come here?" Karl asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "They have to," Hans replied, his voice steady, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "This is a strategic point. They'll want to push us back." As the men began to prepare their weapons and check their gear, the sound of distant artillery grew louder, a relentless reminder of the chaos that awaited them. Karl's mind raced with thoughts of home, of the peaceful existence he had left behind. He could almost hear his mother's voice, urging him to stay safe, to return to her. But what if he never made it back? The thought gnawed at him, a bitter taste in his mouth. The afternoon wore on, the heat oppressive as they gathered around a small fire pit, sharing rations and attempting to find comfort in each other's presence. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of uncertainty hanging over them like a dark cloud. Karl stared into the flickering flames, watching the embers dance, lost in thought. "What do you think will happen when this is all over?" he asked, his voice barely breaking above the crackle of the fire. Hans took a deep drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "I hope we can go back to our lives. I hope we can forget all this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the war, the destruction, and the loss. "Do you really think that's possible?" Karl questioned, a hint of skepticism in his tone. "How can any of us forget what we've seen?" Before Hans could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted their conversation. A group of higher-ranking officers moved through the camp, their expressions serious as they gathered in a tight huddle, voices low and urgent. Karl leaned closer, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. "They're better equipped than we anticipated," one officer said, his brow furrowed in concern. "We need to prepare for their tactics. They've learned from their previous encounters." Karl's heart sank as he listened, the gravity of the situation settling heavily upon him. They were outmatched, outgunned. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He looked at Hans, whose face mirrored his own apprehension. "What do we do if they break through?" Hans whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "We fight," Karl replied, though the words felt hollow. How could they fight against an enemy that had the upper hand? The thought of facing the Americans, of engaging in a battle that seemed futile, filled him with an overwhelming dread. As night fell and the shadows lengthened, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering light upon the faces of the weary soldiers. They huddled together, seeking warmth and solace in each other's company. Yet, the conversations were muted, the laughter absent, as the looming specter of war settled over them. Karl's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He felt the weight of his duty, the loyalty to his country and comrades, but deep down, a nagging doubt persisted. What were they truly fighting for? And at what cost? The humanity he had once believed in began to erode, replaced by a grim realization that the line between right and wrong had become blurred in the chaos of war. As he stared into the flames, he could not shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was merely a prelude to the horrors that awaited them. The night stretched on, filled with unspoken fears and the haunting uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. Karl Wilhelm, a soldier caught in the tide of history, could only brace himself for the tempest that was drawing near. The morning light filtered through the dust-laden air of the small French village, illuminating the remnants of what had once been a lively community. The sound of distant artillery thundered in the background, a grim reminder of the chaos that had engulfed the region. Karl Wilhelm, a young German soldier, stood at the edge of the village square, gripping his rifle tightly, his knuckles white against the wooden stock. He could feel the tension building in the air, an electric charge that seemed to pulse with every distant rumble of cannon fire. Karl's heart raced as he exchanged worried glances with his comrades. The earlier quietude had been shattered, and now the ominous reality of an impending American assault loomed over them like a dark cloud. A sense of foreboding settled in the pit of his stomach, and he could hear the frantic whispers of his fellow soldiers, their voices tinged with fear and uncertainty. "Do you think they'll come for us today?" Hans, his closest friend, whispered, his eyes darting toward the tree line at the edge of the village. "We've got to be ready. They've been pushing hard," Karl replied, his voice low. "If they come, it won't be pretty." The two men had shared countless conversations about home and dreams of returning to their families, but now those thoughts felt distant and almost naive. The camaraderie they had forged in the trenches was a fragile shield against the harsh realities of war. Karl could sense the unease creeping into the hearts of those around him, and it gnawed at him. "Stay sharp, boys," barked their sergeant, a weathered man with a face that bore the scars of multiple battles. "We've got to hold this line. They'll be coming for us soon enough." As if summoned by the sergeant's words, the ground suddenly shook beneath their feet. The first explosion ripped through the air, a deafening roar that sent dirt and debris flying. Instinctively, Karl dropped to the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The once peaceful village was transformed into a scene of terror as the Americans launched their assault. "Get to your positions," shouted the sergeant, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire and explosions. Karl scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he raced toward the makeshift barricade they had erected. The chaos was overwhelming. Smoke filled the air, and the acrid scent of gunpowder stung Karl's nostrils. He could hear the cries of his fellow soldiers mingling with the distant shouts of the Americans. The world around him felt surreal, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. "Cover me!" Karl shouted to Hans, who was crouching beside him, eyes wide with fear. They exchanged a brief nod before Karl peered over the barricade, trying to gauge the enemy's position. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he could make out the silhouettes of American soldiers advancing, their faces grim and determined. "Here they come," Hans shouted, his voice trembling. Karl's heart raced as he aimed his rifle, his hands shaking. He had trained for this moment, yet the reality of taking a life felt foreign and terrifying. He squeezed the trigger, the weapon jerking against his shoulder, and watched as one of the advancing soldiers fell. But the victory was short-lived. The Americans retaliated with a barrage of gunfire, and the sound of bullets whizzing past his head sent a jolt of fear through Karl's body. He ducked behind the barricade, his mind racing as he tried to process the chaos unfolding around him. "Karl, we need to fall back," Hans yelled, panic lacing his voice. "We can't hold this position. No, we can't give up," Karl shouted back, desperation fueling his resolve. But as the gunfire intensified, he felt the weight of his decision crushing him. The reality of war was stark and unforgiving, and the line between right and wrong blurred with every passing moment. As the battle raged on, Karl found himself in a state of shock, witnessing the devastation wrought upon his fellow soldiers. He heard the cries of the wounded and the anguished shouts of those who had lost their friends. Each sound felt like a dagger to his heart, and he wondered how many more lives would be claimed before the day was over. In the midst of the chaos, something caught Karl's eye. A soldier, sprawled on the ground, was struggling to crawl away from the battlefield. The man's uniform was tattered, and his face was twisted in pain. Karl's instinct screamed at him to focus on survival, to protect his own, but something deeper stirred within him, a flicker of humanity that refused to be extinguished. "Help!" the American soldier gasped, his voice barely audible over the din of gunfire. "Please," Karl hesitated, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands. The conflict within him raged like the battle outside. He knew he should turn away, that every instinct told him to protect his own, but the look in the man's eyes, the raw desperation, was enough to shatter his resolve. "Hold on!" Karl shouted, his voice barely above a whisper as he crouched low and made his way toward the man. He could feel Hans' shocked gaze burning into his back, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. As he reached the American soldier, Karl's heart raced. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "John," the soldier gasped, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. I can't move." "Okay, John, I'm going to help you," Karl said, his voice firm despite the chaos around them. He quickly glanced back at Hans, who looked torn between disbelief and anger. "Cover me." With a grunt, Karl pulled John's arm over his shoulder, supporting the wounded man as best he could. The gunfire continued to rain down around them, but Karl focused on the task at hand. They needed to find shelter, a place where he could tend to John's wounds. "Why are you helping me?" John asked, his voice strained. "I'm the enemy." "Because you're a human being," Karl replied, his tone surprisingly calm despite the turmoil around them. "We're all just trying to survive." As they stumbled toward a nearby abandoned building, Karl felt a bond forming between them, a connection that transcended the lines drawn by war. He could see the fear in John's eyes, the same fear that mirrored his own, and it struck him how similar they were. Two men caught in a conflict not of their making. They reached the crumbling structure, and Karl quickly ushered John inside, away from the chaos outside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with shadows that danced to the rhythm of the exploding shells outside. Karl lowered John to the ground, his heart racing as he assessed the wound. "I've got to stop the bleeding," he muttered, tearing a strip from his uniform to use as a makeshift bandage. John winced as Karl applied pressure to the wound, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. "Why are you doing this?" John asked, confusion etched on his face. "You could get shot for helping me." Karl paused, the weight of the question hanging in the air. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe because I refuse to let this war take away my humanity." As the sounds of battle raged on outside, Karl felt an internal battle of his own. He was torn between loyalty to his country and the realization that compassion could exist even in the darkest of times. The conflict within him grew, a churning storm of doubt and fear, but he knew he couldn't abandon John. "Just hold on, okay?" Karl urged, pressing down harder on the bandage. "Help will come." Outside, the gunfire continued, but in that moment, within the confines of the decrepit building, a fragile understanding blossomed between the two men. They were no longer enemies. They were simply two soldiers caught in an unimaginable situation, searching for a glimmer of hope amidst the horror of war. As night fell, the sounds of battle began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the village. Karl sat beside John, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He could hear footsteps approaching, the unmistakable sounds of soldiers moving through the rubble. Fear gripped him, and he glanced at John, whose eyes were wide with terror. "They're coming," John whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't let them find you," Karl promised, determination flooding his veins. He looked around the small shelter, desperate for a way to conceal the wounded soldier. The darkness enveloped them, but the threat was palpable, a reminder that in war, kindness often came with a heavy price. With every passing moment, the footsteps grew louder and Karl's heart raced. He could feel the tension building, a palpable fear that gripped him like a vice. The line he had drawn between loyalty to his country and compassion for a fellow soldier blurred further with every sound approaching. "Please," John said, his voice barely above a whisper, "don't let them hurt me." The innocence in John's plea struck a chord deep within Karl. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come, ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that he had made a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. The morning light filtered through the remnants of the village, casting eerie shadows on the rubble that once represented a place of peace. Karl Wilhelm stood amongst his fellow soldiers, their faces drawn and gaunt, eyes hollow from sleepless nights filled with the cacophony of war. Today, they were not merely defenders of their country. They were desperate men clinging to a thread of hope amidst the chaos. "Gather around," barked the sergeant, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Karl felt his heart quicken as he joined the group, the weight of his rifle heavy against his shoulder. The sergeant, a weathered man with a scar running down his cheek, began to outline their plan for a counteroffensive. "We'll push back the Americans today. We can't let them take this village." His determination was palpable, but Karl couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his stomach. As they prepared, the air was thick with unspoken fears. Karl exchanged glances with Hans, who stood nearby, his brow furrowed in concern. "Do you really think we can do this?" Hans asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Karl opened his mouth to respond, but the words faltered. He wanted to reassure Hans, to remind him of the courage they had shown before, but the horrors of the previous day loomed large in his mind. Instead, he simply nodded. "We have to try." The morning air was crisp, and the distant sounds of gunfire echoed like a haunting melody. Karl and his comrades moved cautiously through the debris-strewn village, the remnants of homes and lives scattered around them. Each step felt like a march toward an uncertain fate. The tension was palpable, and the silence was occasionally broken by the distant cries of the wounded. "Cover me!" shouted a soldier as he dashed forward, drawing enemy fire. Karl's instincts kicked in, and he raised his rifle, the world narrowing to the sight before him. He squeezed the trigger, his hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The sounds of gunfire and explosions mingled, creating a hellish symphony that drowned out all rational thought. As they advanced, Karl witnessed the true horrors of war. A fellow soldier fell beside him, blood pooling around him, a grim reminder of the cost of their actions. "Get him out! We can't leave him!" someone shouted, but the urgency of their mission pressed on. Karl's heart raced as he struggled to reconcile the humanity of his fallen comrade with the relentless drive to survive. The squad pressed forward, pushing back against the Americans with a ferocity born from desperation. Karl fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, each gunshot echoing his internal conflict. He felt the weight of the rifle, but it felt heavier with each pull of the trigger. The cries of the wounded pierced his heart, and the images of the dying haunted his mind. "Fall back! Fall back!" the sergeant ordered, and the order cut through the chaos like a knife. The retreat was a chaotic scramble, soldiers moving in every direction, fear driving them away from the front line. Karl felt a surge of panic as he stumbled over debris, his breath quickening. The realization hit him like a cold wave. They were losing. As his unit fell back, Karl's thoughts turned to John, the American soldier he had saved. He had acted against his instincts, and now he feared the consequences might be dire. He had risked everything, and for what? The weight of his choice crushed him, and he felt a sense of betrayal toward his own comrades. How could he explain his actions when they were taught to see the enemy as less than human? When the dust settled, Karl returned to the makeshift shelter where he had hidden John. His heart sank as he realized the American soldier was gone. Panic washed over him. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The guilt clawed at him, threatening to consume him whole. Had his compassion endangered his unit? Had he unwittingly betrayed the very people he had sworn to protect? He searched the area frantically, hoping against hope that John had merely moved to find safety, but deep down, he feared the worst. The shadows of the past day lingered heavily in the air, and the cries of the wounded echoed in his mind as he tried to rationalize his actions. "Where is he?" Karl muttered to himself, pacing the small confines of the shelter. "I should have kept a closer watch." The weight of his decision pressed down like a heavy shroud. He had chosen to save a life, yet in doing so, had he put his own comrades in danger? The sounds of the battlefield faded into the background as he lost himself in thought, recalling the brief moment of connection he shared with John. Their eyes had spoken volumes, transcending the boundaries of war, and now, that connection felt like a cruel joke. What had he done? As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, Karl returned to his unit, feeling like a ghost among the living. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of his secret felt heavier than ever. He joined a small group of soldiers gathered around a fire, but the camaraderie that once bonded them seemed distant now. "Did you hear about Schmidt?" one soldier asked, his voice filled with anger. "He didn't make it. Got hit when we were falling back." "This is all your fault, Wilhelm." Karl's heart raced at the accusation. "What do you mean?" he stammered, feeling the heat of their glares burn into him. "You think we can just save a damn American and everything will be fine?" Another soldier shouted. "You're putting us all at risk." The words struck him like blows. "I was trying to save a life," Karl protested, his voice rising in desperation. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" "Not when it's the enemy," a soldier retorted, his face twisted in disdain. "You think they'll show you mercy? You think they care about you?" The confrontation escalated, voices rising as anger and fear spilled over. Karl felt isolated, trapped in a storm of accusations and doubts. He glanced around at the faces of his comrades, once filled with shared resolve, now marred by suspicion and resentment. "I didn't do it for him," Karl said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I did it because it was right. I don't care if he wears a different uniform. He's a human being just like us." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could feel the tension crackling around them, the divide growing ever wider. "Right or wrong, you put us all in danger," a soldier finally said, his voice cold as ice. "And for what? To play the hero? You should have thought about the consequences." Karl's heart sank as the realization dawned on him. They were no longer a united front. They were a fractured squad, torn apart by fear and doubt. The horrors of war were not just in the battlefield, but also within the hearts of those who fought. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Karl sat in silence, grappling with the enormity of his actions. The screams of the wounded haunted him, and he wondered if he could ever find peace amidst the chaos that surrounded him. The line between right and wrong blurred, and he was left adrift in a sea of uncertainty, questioning everything he had been taught about loyalty, honor, and humanity. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder, a haunting reminder of the chaos that raged around them. Karl Wilhelm crouched behind a crumbling wall, his heart pounding in his chest as he clutched his rifle. The Americans were advancing again, their assault more coordinated and relentless than ever. He could hear the shouts of his comrades mingling with the distant echoes of artillery fire, a cacophony that filled him with dread. Beside him, Hans was loading his weapon, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Karl, we need to hold this position. They're coming in waves." His voice was barely audible over the din, but Karl understood the gravity of the situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned, yet the thought of retreat was a bitter pill to swallow. As the first wave of American soldiers surged forward, Karl's mind raced with conflicting emotions. He had saved one of them, John, a decision that plagued him with uncertainty. Was he a traitor to his country or a savior to a fellow human being? The lines of right and wrong blurred in the fog of war, and all he could see were the faces of those who would suffer if they failed to hold the line. Suddenly, in the midst of the chaos, he caught sight of John, now armed and fighting fiercely alongside his comrades. The sight of the American soldier sent a jolt through Karl's body. Their eyes locked for a fleeting moment, and time seemed to stand still. It was as if the world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them in a frozen tableau of conflict and confusion. "Why?" Karl shouted over the clamor, his voice strained with emotion. "Why are we doing this?" John hesitated, his rifle raised but not yet aimed at Karl. "I could ask you the same thing," he yelled back, panting from exertion. "We're just following orders, right? But is this what we really want?" Karl's grip on his rifle tightened, and he felt a surge of anger mixed with understanding. "And what do you want?" he pressed, desperate to bridge the chasm that war had forged between them. Before John could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted around them, pulling them back into the reality of battle. The moment was lost, and Karl was forced to regain his focus. He fired at an approaching enemy soldier, his instincts taking over as he fought for survival. As the battle raged on, Karl found himself alongside John once more. The two men dodged enemy fire, their movements synchronized as if they were no longer enemies, but allies in a desperate struggle for life. They fought back to back, each covering the other's blind spots, and for a brief moment, camaraderie replaced enmity. "I never wanted this," John shouted as they took cover behind a fallen tree. "I don't want to kill anyone, Karl." "Neither do I," Karl replied, his voice filled with anguish. "But what choice do we have? We're trapped." In that moment, a realization washed over Karl. They were both pawns in a game played by men in distant offices, far removed from the bloodshed. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also human beings, caught in an endless cycle of violence that stripped them of their humanity. Suddenly, an explosion erupted nearby, sending debris flying through the air. Karl instinctively shielded John, feeling the heat of the blast as it threw them apart. The deafening sound rang in his ears as he struggled to regain his footing, panic surging through him. He turned frantically, searching for John, but the smoke obscured his vision. "John!" he called out, his heart racing as he scanned the chaos around him. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and the sight of fallen soldiers, both German and American, lay scattered on the ground. The reality of war crashed down on him like a wave, and he felt a visceral response to the suffering that surrounded him. Then, through the haze, he spotted John, disoriented but alive, emerging from the smoke. Relief flooded through Karl, but it was short-lived. In the confusion, they had become separated from their units, and the battlefield felt increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. "Over here!" John yelled, gesturing for Karl to join him. "We need to regroup." They stumbled towards each other, their breaths heavy with exhaustion and fear. When they finally reached one another, Karl could see the fear in John's eyes mirrored in his own. They were no longer just soldiers. They were two men fighting for survival, bound by the shared horror of their situation. "We can't keep doing this," John said, his voice shaky. "We need to find a way out." Karl nodded, feeling the weight of their circumstances pressing down on him. "But where? The lines are collapsing and we're surrounded." For a moment, they stood in silence, the reality of their predicament settling heavily upon them. In that instant, the sounds of battle faded into the background, leaving only the two of them, caught in a moment of understanding. They were not just enemies. They were men with dreams, families, and lives waiting for them back home. "What if," John began hesitantly, "what if we just put our weapons down? Maybe we can walk away from all this." Karl's heart raced at the thought. Could they really abandon their post and risk everything? But looking into John's eyes, he saw a flicker of hope, a possibility of peace amidst the chaos. Maybe we could try," he said, uncertainty lacing his words. "But what about the others?" Before John could respond, another explosion shook the ground, forcing them both to drop to the earth. In the aftermath, Karl felt the heat of the blast wash over him, and for a moment, he feared that this would be their end. Yet, as he looked up, he realized that they had been thrown into a new reality, a chance to escape the cycle of violence. "Come on," John urged, pulling Karl to his feet. "We've got to move before they regroup." Together, they dashed through the wreckage, hearts pounding in unison as they navigated the debris of war. The world around them was a landscape of destruction, but in that shared sprint, they forged a bond that transcended their uniforms and allegiances. As they ran, Karl's thoughts drifted back to everything he had been taught about the enemy, the propaganda that filled his mind with hatred and fear. In John, he saw not a foe but a reflection of himself, a man driven by the same instincts to survive, to protect, and to find meaning amidst the chaos. "Do you think we'll make it?" Karl asked breathlessly, glancing at John as they ducked behind a wall for cover. "I don't know," John replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But we have to try, for ourselves." Just as they caught their breath and began to formulate a plan, the ground shook again beneath them, an explosion ringing out with a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air, and Karl felt a surge of panic as he turned to find John. "John!" he shouted, but the smoke enveloped them, obscuring his vision. In that moment, he realized how fleeting their connection had been, how the war could tear them apart in an instant. As the smoke began to clear, Karl's heart sank. He was alone, the echoes of battle surrounding him. The bond he thought they had forged felt tenuous in the face of the chaos that engulfed them. Would he ever see John again? The questions hung heavy in his mind, and the weight of regret settled like a stone in his chest. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the Americans regrouping, their voices rising above the din of gunfire. Panic surged within him as he grappled with the reality of their situation. The war raged on, and in the chaos, everything he had fought for, everything he believed in, was crumbling around him. Alone in the midst of the battlefield, Karl faced a harrowing truth. The lines between friend and foe, right and wrong, were no longer clear. All that remained was the haunting question of what it meant to be human in a world engulfed in war. The village lay in ruins, a desolate reminder of the fierce battle that had recently unfolded. Smoke still curled from the remnants of houses, and the acrid scent of gunpowder lingered in the air. Karl Wilhelm stood among the wreckage, his heart heavy with guilt and despair. He surveyed the devastation around him, the once vibrant streets now reduced to a graveyard of memories. Each collapsed wall and shattered window felt like a personal failure, a weight he could no longer bear. Karl's mind flickered back to the moment he had saved John, the American soldier. In the chaos of battle, their eyes had met, and in that fleeting instant, they had transcended the roles of enemy combatants. But now, as he stumbled through the debris, he was plagued by doubt. Had that act of compassion been a mistake? Had it endangered not only himself but also his comrades? The faces of his fallen friends haunted him, their laughter and dreams now extinguished by the merciless hand of war. "Karl!" A voice called out, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. It was Hans, his closest friend, emerging from the shadows with dirt streaked across his face. "We need to regroup. The others are waiting." Karl nodded, but his gaze remained distant. "They're gone, Hans. We lost so many today." His voice trembled, the weight of his emotions threatening to break free. Hans placed a reassuring hand on Karl's shoulder. "We have to keep going. For them, we owe it to their memory." His words were firm, but Karl could see the worry etched on his friend's face. They both understood that the war was far from over. As they made their way back to the remnants of their base, Karl couldn't shake the image of John from his mind. What had become of him? Was he still alive? The thought of the enemy soldier, the man he had saved, filled him with a conflicting mix of hope and dread. Karl had seen the compassion in the eyes of the American soldiers, a stark contrast to the propaganda he had been fed about their brutality. It made him question everything he had ever believed. "Do you think they're all like that?" Karl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Americans, I mean." Hans glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They care for their wounded, Hans. I saw them out there, tending to their own like they were family. It's not what we've been taught." Hans shifted uncomfortably. "We're at war, Karl. They're the enemy. We can't forget that." "But why?" Karl's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Why are we fighting them? We're all just men, Hans. Fighting for our countries, our families. Doesn't that matter?" Hans's expression hardened. "It matters, but we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. We have a duty to our country." "And what about our duty to humanity?" Karl shot back, his voice rising. "I've seen enough death and destruction. I'm tired of it, Hans. Tired of the lies." Before Hans could respond, a loud explosion echoed in the distance, shaking the ground beneath their feet. They both instinctively crouched low, fear flooding back into their veins. "We need to find shelter," Hans urged, his voice urgent. "The fighting isn't over." As they moved cautiously through the wreckage, Karl's thoughts raced. The documents he had stumbled across earlier that day weighed heavily on him. They revealed that his superiors had known about the impending American attack, but had chosen to send them into battle anyway, sacrificing their lives for a strategy that seemed increasingly futile. It felt like a betrayal, a cruel joke played on the very soldiers who were supposed to defend their country. "Did you hear that?" Karl suddenly halted, straining to listen. The sounds of voices drifted through the rubble. Slowly, he and Hans edged closer, curiosity piquing their interest. Peering around a crumbling wall, Karl's breath caught in his throat. A group of American soldiers were gathered in a small clearing, tending to their wounded. The sight was surreal. They moved with a sense of urgency and care that he hadn't expected. A medic was applying a bandage to a soldier's arm, while others shared rations and water, their camaraderie evident even in the face of adversity. "They're just like us," Karl murmured, almost to himself. "They care for their own." Hans shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. "We shouldn't be here, Karl. What if they see us?" But Karl couldn't tear his gaze away. "Look at them, Hans. They're not monsters. They're men trying to survive. They'll kill us if they find us." Hans replied, his voice low and urgent. "We need to go back." Just as Karl was about to step back, a soldier from the American group turned, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Karl's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively ducked behind the wall. "What if they're friendly?" he whispered, the idea taking root in his mind. "Friendly?" Hans scoffed. "They're the enemy. Remember that." But Karl's mind was racing. If these soldiers were willing to care for their wounded, perhaps they could find common ground. Perhaps, in this chaotic world, a glimmer of peace could emerge. "I need to know," Karl said resolutely. "I need to understand." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "I'm going to talk to them." "Are you out of your mind?" Hans exclaimed, grabbing Karl's arm. "You can't just walk up to them." "They saved lives today, Hans," Karl replied, his voice firm. "I have to see for myself." With that, Karl stepped out from behind the wall, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The American soldiers immediately turned, weapons at the ready. "Wait, I'm German. I'm unarmed," he called out, his heart racing. The tension was palpable as the soldiers exchanged wary glances. Slowly, one of them stepped forward, lowering his weapon slightly. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice cautious but not hostile. I just want to talk," Karl stammered, his eyes wide with fear and determination. "I want to understand." The soldiers looked at each other, uncertainty etched on their faces. "Why should we trust you?" the American soldier retorted, his grip still tight on his rifle. "Because I'm tired of this war," Karl said, his voice gaining strength. "I saw you help your wounded. I saw compassion. I want to know why we're fighting, why we can't just put down our guns and talk." The American soldier's expression softened slightly. "You have no idea what you're asking for, do you? This is war. It's not that simple." "Maybe it should be," Karl replied, his voice steady. "We're all just trying to survive. What if we could find a way to stop this madness?" The American soldier hesitated, glancing back at his comrades. "You think talking will change anything?" "Maybe it will," Karl insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "If we don't try, then what's the point?" A heavy silence fell over the clearing as the soldiers considered his words. For a fleeting moment, the walls of animosity seemed to waver, and the realization hit Karl that perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope for understanding amidst the chaos of war. Karl Wilhelm's heart raced as he approached the weathered building that served as his commanding officer's headquarters. The scent of smoke and gunpowder lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the chaos that had erupted around him. He clutched the documents tightly in his hands, the fragile sheets filled with damning evidence of betrayal. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, doubt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. He couldn't let the senseless bloodshed continue. Not when he knew the truth. "Come on, Karl," he muttered to himself, steeling his resolve. "You have to do this." As he neared the entrance, he was abruptly pulled back to reality by the sound of gunfire erupting all around him. The sharp crack of rifles and the dull thud of artillery shells echoed in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The juxtaposition of his mission and the surrounding violence made his chest tighten. He needed to reach his commanding officer, but it felt as if the world was conspiring against him. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire shattered the air, and Karl instinctively threw himself to the ground. He looked up just in time to see a group of American soldiers advancing through the debris-strewn street. They moved with a sense of purpose, their faces grim and determined. Karl's heart sank as he realized he was caught in the crossfire, trapped between two worlds that no longer acknowledged his existence. "Get down!" a voice shouted nearby. It was one of his fellow soldiers, a panicked look in his eyes as he gestured for Karl to find cover. Before Karl could react, bullets whizzed past him, and he felt a searing pain in his leg. He grunted, collapsing onto the ground, the documents slipping from his fingers and fluttering away like fallen leaves. The world spun around him as he clutched his injured leg, blood seeping through his fingers. He heard the sounds of chaos. The shouts of soldiers, the cries of the wounded, the constant barrage of gunfire. "Stay down," another soldier yelled, but Karl's vision blurred, his thoughts racing. He was losing too much blood, and the pain was overwhelming. Just as despair began to claw at him, he heard a familiar voice cut through the cacophony. "Karl, stay down." It was John, the American soldier he had saved, now rushing toward him with a look of determination etched on his face. "Karl!" John shouted again, fear and urgency in his tone as he dodged enemy fire to reach him. "I'm coming!" Time seemed to slow as Karl looked up at John, a mixture of gratitude and confusion swirling within him. John was no longer just an enemy. He was the embodiment of a bond that had formed amidst the chaos. Karl had risked everything to save him, and now, here they were, on the brink of destruction, united by fate. "Get down!" John yelled again as he reached Karl's side, quickly assessing the situation. He knelt beside him, his hands moving with practiced urgency as he tore a strip from his shirt to apply pressure to Karl's wound. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." Karl winced, the pain intensifying as John pressed down on the injury. I couldn't reach the documents," he gasped, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. "Forget the documents," John replied fiercely, his eyes meeting Karl's with an intensity that sent a jolt through him. "We need to get you out of here. This isn't over yet." As John worked quickly to staunch the bleeding, Karl's mind raced, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. The bond they had forged in the midst of war, the compassion he had shown, was it all leading to this moment? They were on opposite sides. Yet here they were, fighting not just for their lives, but for something deeper that transcended the conflict. "Why did you help me?" John asked suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You could have left me to die out there." I don't know," Karl admitted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "In that moment, I saw you as a person, not the enemy. I couldn't just stand by." John's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the horrors of war faded into the background. "You're braver than most," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to move now. They won't stop shooting, and we're running out of time." Just as Karl nodded, a deafening explosion rocked the ground, sending debris flying in every direction. He felt the shock wave hit him, and instinctively, he turned toward John, who was still beside him, eyes wide with panic. The world around them was chaos. Gunfire, shouts, and explosions all converging into a cacophony of terror. "Get up," John urged, grabbing Karl's arm and pulling him to his feet. Karl stumbled, pain shooting through his leg, but John steadied him. "We have to get to cover. I won't leave you behind." With John's support, Karl hobbled toward a nearby building, the walls crumbling and charred from previous battles. They ducked inside, gasping for breath as they surveyed their surroundings. The room was dark, filled with the smell of dust and decay, but it offered a momentary refuge from the chaos outside. "Are you okay?" John asked, concern etched on his features as he helped Karl to the ground. "I've been better," Karl replied with a grim smile, trying to lighten the mood despite the pain in his leg. "But I've also been worse." John chuckled softly, but the tension in his eyes remained. "We can't stay here for long. They'll find us." Just then, Karl's heart raced as a sudden thought struck him. "John, what if we're not just enemies? What if?" He hesitated, the weight of the words heavy on his tongue. "What if what?" John pressed, his brow furrowing. "What if we're more than just soldiers on opposing sides? What if there's a connection between us?" For a moment, silence hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, with a look of realization dawning on his face, John responded, "You mean?" "Yes," Karl breathed, his heart pounding. "I've been searching for my brother since the war began. He was taken from our family. I thought I'd lost him forever." The air thickened with the weight of their revelations. "Your brother?" John whispered, his eyes widening in shock. "Karl, Just then, the ground outside shook again, and the realities of their situation flooded back in. "We need to focus on getting you out of here," John said, his voice firm. "But if you're saying what I think you're saying, if you're as captivated by these stories as we are, make sure to subscribe and join us for more incredible journeys through history. You won't want to miss what's coming next." "I need to know," Karl insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I need to know if you're my brother, if you're the one I've been searching for." John's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Karl, my name is John," he said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "But I was taken from my family too. I don't remember much before the war." "John," Karl felt a surge of hope intertwining with fear. "Could it be?" "I don't know, Karl," John admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "But there's only one way to find out." In that moment, they shared a glance that transcended the horror of their circumstances. In the midst of war, amidst the bloodshed and chaos, they had found something they had both lost: each other. As they prepared to face the uncertain future together, they knew one thing for sure. They were brothers bound not just by blood, but by the shared pain of a world torn apart by conflict. Together, they would navigate the chaos, seeking not just survival, but the hope of reconciliation, healing, and the possibility of a life beyond the war.